My daughter screamed, "If you won't go to a home, get out of our house." Still, I didn't react, my hands steady as I folded the last shirt. As her words echoed, the sharp scent of her perfume lingered in the room. While I picked up my suitcase, the soft purr of a limo engine rose outside. That's when I realized this wasn't just her house anymore. I walked past her, out the door, and into a life she could never take from me. The limo door shut behind me. It was time to reclaim what was mine. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The clink of plates echoed softly as Margaret placed the last dish in the dishwasher, her movements methodical. The warm, yellow light from the kitchen cast long shadows on the walls, but she didn't mind the solitude. The quiet had become her friend, a space where she could breathe without the heavy presence of judgment hanging over her. From the living room, she heard Carolyn's sigh, a sharp, barely contained sound of frustration. It wasn't new. Carolyn had been sighing a lot lately, as if the air in their home had grown thick and oppressive, suffocating her. Margaret felt it too. It hung in the spaces between their words, in the weight of the silence when no one spoke. Ethan sat on the couch, his hands in his lap, staring at the TV but not watching it. He had become a fixture in this house, always neutral, always distant. Margaret had long stopped expecting him to speak up, to break the tension, to do anything more than exist in the background of his wife's decisions. He was the quiet passenger in the car, just along for the ride. "I'll take the kids to school in the morning," Margaret called out, her voice soft but clear. She had offered this many times before, the same polite gesture to make herself useful, to offer a small piece of help in a home that had grown increasingly hostile. Carolyn didn't answer right away, and for a moment, Margaret thought she might have let it go. But then Carolyn's voice, tight and edged with something sharper than just frustration, sliced through the air. "She's always here." Margaret froze, her hand hovering over the dishwasher. She had heard it before. The way Carolyn said it, like her presence was an unwelcome burden. It wasn't the first time Carolyn had used those words, but tonight it stung in a way that felt different, more cutting. Margaret set the dish down, slowly, and turned toward the living room. She didn't look directly at Carolyn. That would have been too much. Instead, she watched her daughter from the periphery, her back turned, her eyes fixed on the empty space in front of her. She was angry. No, not angry. Frustrated. Resentful. She wasn't the child anymore. No, Carolyn had long since grown into a woman who couldn't hide her resentment, even if she tried to mask it under the guise of practicality. It was all too clear now. This wasn't just about space. It was about being seen. Or, more accurately, about Margaret not being seen at all. "I said, if you won't go to a home," Carolyn's voice cracked like a whip, loud and sharp. "Get out of our house." The words hung in the air, heavy and jagged, settling into the room like dust. Margaret's chest tightened, but her face remained still, emotion masked by the calm that had always defined her. She was so used to holding everything in, to being the one who took the blows, who swallowed every insult with grace. But this was different. She didn't move. She just stood there, holding her breath, as Carolyn's anger poured out like an open tap. Ethan didn't say anything, his silence adding weight to the air, making Margaret feel like she was drowning in it. Silence stretched for a moment, and then Carolyn's voice came again, lower, but no less resolute. "I mean it. You're not staying past this weekend." Margaret's hand clenched around the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. She wanted to say something, to tell Carolyn that she didn't have the right to speak to her that way, but she didn't. Not now. Not yet. Instead, she turned slowly and walked back to the kitchen, where the hum of the dishwasher was a reminder of how little she had ever truly mattered here. She set the last plate down with a quiet clink, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and walked to her bedroom without a word. The door clicked softly behind her as she locked it. She didn't need to hear anything else. Not tonight. She moved toward her suitcase, sitting at the foot of her bed, and pulled it open. The small black binder was there, tucked carefully between a stack of folded clothes. It had been there for months, waiting. Margaret had known this moment would come. She had known it since the first time Carolyn had sighed like that, since the first time she had made her feel like an inconvenience. But this wasn't about just leaving. This was about reclaiming what was hers. This was about drawing the line, wherever it had to be drawn. She flipped open the binder, the pages crisp and clean, and read the contents again, not for the first time. The signature was already in place. Everything was ready. In that moment, the weight of her daughter's words didn't seem so crushing anymore. The years of silence, of being overlooked, of being the invisible one, they didn't matter now. She was done being the quiet guest in her own life. She stood there, alone in the room, the quiet hum of the house around her. No more waiting. No more pretending. No more letting herself be erased. Tomorrow, everything would change. The last of her doubt melted away, and with it, the final vestige of her restraint. The cold gray light of dawn seeped through the curtains, casting faint streaks across the hardwood floor of Margaret's bedroom. She hadn't slept much, the sheets twisted in quiet disarray beneath her. She had expected to be awake at this hour, despite the events of the night before. It felt like everything was suspended in a heavy, still air waiting to move, waiting for her to move. Margaret had packed in silence, her mind laser-focused on what came next. Her clothes, neatly folded, lay in her suitcase, but it was the small black binder she carried that mattered most now. She had known what Carolyn's words meant, had known for years that this moment would come, but she had never expected it to sting as much as it did. Carolyn's anger was expected, yes, but it didn't make it easier. Now, Margaret stood in front of the full-length mirror, her reflection quiet and steady. She smoothed her blouse, adjusting her posture just slightly, as if making one final subtle declaration to the woman she had been in this house, to the woman she would never be again. There was a soft knock at the door. Margaret didn't move immediately. She wanted to savor the last moments of this house, of the air that had become so thick with tension, so heavy with resentment. She had spent years quietly enduring, years watching Carolyn, Ethan, and even the kids slowly slip away from her, never acknowledging how small they were making her feel, how invisible she had become. Another knock, this time more insistent. Margaret finally exhaled, gathering her strength. She stepped to the door, opened it, and there he stood. The driver, tall, suited, impassive. Margaret simply nodded. She didn't need to speak. She had already said everything in the letter she'd left behind. Downstairs, the front door creaked open. The sound carried like an omen through the house, an announcement of her departure. Carolyn stood by the window in the living room, her back to the door. Her shoulders were tight, her arms crossed. She hadn't moved when Margaret had walked past her earlier, but Margaret could feel her eyes on her back, sharp and full of accusation. She didn't acknowledge her daughter's presence as she walked toward the door. She wasn't sure if Carolyn even cared enough to ask where she was going. Not anymore. Ethan's voice finally broke the silence. "Where are you going?" He didn't sound angry or concerned, just tired, as if he too had long expected this. Margaret turned slowly, her eyes meeting his for the first time that morning. His indifference, as always, stung more than anything. She could see it in his posture, the way his hands were buried deep in his pockets, his eyes avoiding hers. He wasn't curious about her. He was just waiting for her to leave. "Somewhere I'm not resented," Margaret replied, her voice even. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that hung in the air between them. The words seemed to hit harder than she expected. She saw a brief flicker of emotion pass through Ethan's face, something like guilt. Or maybe it was just the shadow of something he'd been trying to avoid for years. But he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He already knew. Margaret stepped past him, moving toward the door. She could feel the cool draft from the outside, a subtle promise of freedom. Before she stepped into the threshold, she turned back. Carolyn was still standing by the window, but now she was watching her. No words, just a stillness that spoke volumes. Margaret held the envelope in her hand, the one she had carefully sealed the night before, the one she had signed with a finality that could never be undone. She walked over to Carolyn and held out the letter. "You'll need this by Monday," Margaret said. Her tone was cool, controlled, the calm of a woman who had finally stopped fighting for someone else's approval. Carolyn didn't move at first. She didn't take the letter. Margaret waited for a moment, and then, with a final glance, she turned and walked out the door, her footsteps muffled by the carpeted floor. The driver stood at the ready, holding the car door open for her. She climbed into the back seat without another word, and the door clicked shut behind her. As the car started, Margaret looked out the window, watching the house she had once called home shrink in the distance. The quiet hum of the engine was a steady rhythm, like the beating of her own heart, calm and certain. She wasn't leaving just for the sake of leaving. She was walking away from something far deeper, something she had allowed herself to lose for too long. It wasn't long before the car turned onto a long, winding driveway, flanked by stately trees. As the vehicle made its way up the lane, Margaret could see the looming building in the distance, the Churchill Senior Living Estates. She had heard of it before. Jeanette had raved about it often, but it had always felt like a world away. Until now. The car came to a stop at the grand entrance. Margaret's eyes took in the polished exterior, the elegance of it all, the feeling of something new and fresh. She wasn't sure what to expect. Maybe a bit of warmth, a hint of invitation, but there was nothing more than the calm professionalism of the staff. They were waiting for her, ready to show her to her suite. Jeanette was waiting too, her smile wide as she held a glass of wine in her hand. "Welcome to the good life, Margaret," Jeanette said with a smirk, raising her glass in a mock toast. "I'm sure you'll find this place more accommodating." Margaret took a step inside, the sound of her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. She couldn't help but smile, a small, knowing smile. Jeanette wasn't wrong. This place was certainly a far cry from the coldness of her daughter's home. The staff led her through the spacious hallways, past rows of rooms, until they came to her suite. As the door opened, Margaret stepped in, her gaze sweeping across the hardwood floors and the large windows that offered a stunning view of the landscaped gardens outside. It was peaceful here, unassuming, a place where she would finally be seen. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The door they didn't expect to open had swung wide, and she was stepping through it with everything she needed in her hands. The quiet clink of the envelope's seal breaking was the only sound in the room. Margaret sat at the desk in her new suite at Churchill Estates, the letters she had left for Carolyn still fresh in her mind. She had expected more, maybe a phone call, some kind of reaction. But instead, all she had received was silence. Carolyn would read the letter eventually, but the question was how much of it would sink in. With steady hands, Margaret unfolded the thick paper, the weight of it somehow heavier than it looked. The first paragraph outlined her decision, simple and direct. Effective immediately, Carolyn Baxter Rhodes will be removed as secondary beneficiary on the estate. Margaret paused, her gaze drifting over the lines, the words she had carefully crafted. She had anticipated the fallout. It was the kind of decision that made people take notice, but also one that would sting deeply. Carolyn had never understood the weight of Margaret's patience. She had always assumed there was nothing beneath the surface but quiet submission. The next section of the letter wasn't as cold, but equally deliberate. A detailed list. Utilities, insurance premiums, tuition, property taxes, all of it was there. A painstaking inventory of the hidden support Margaret had been silently providing over the years. It was a ledger of her quietly held sacrifices, paid without a word, never acknowledged. Her eyes skimmed the list. Water bill. Paid for 6 months, total. $1,200, electricity and gas. Monthly, always current Sadie's tuition at St. Peter's. Paid annually without fail. Insurance premiums. For the house and the car. Full coverage. There were dozens of items, each a tiny sacrifice, hidden in the background of their lives, kept from their knowledge. She had never asked for gratitude, but perhaps now Carolyn would realize just how much her mother had quietly carried for her. Margaret set the letter down and let out a slow breath. Carolyn's reaction would be inevitable, and it would be loud, but it would also be a reckoning, a sudden wake-up call that had been a long time coming. The phone rang, slicing through the calm of the morning. Margaret glanced at the display, recognizing the number instantly. "Hello, Lewis." "Margaret, everything's been updated." Lewis Caldwell's voice came through with the same sharp professionalism he always carried. "We're clear. The new terms have been processed and I've filed the amendments. It's airtight." Margaret let the words settle in, her grip tightening slightly on the edge of the desk. "Thank you. I want to be absolutely certain. No loopholes, no chances for Carolyn to try and fight this." "You're covered," Lewis confirmed. "The will is updated and registered. There's nothing left to chance." Margaret's lips curled into the smallest of smiles. She had waited for years, quietly holding on to this power, not even fully aware of it until recently. But now, the tide was turning. The sound of footsteps outside her suite's door broke her concentration, followed by a light knock. "Come in," Margaret called, and the door swung open to reveal Jeanette, a glass of wine in hand, her usual smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. "Celebrating yet?" Jeanette asked, her voice low, knowing. Margaret smiled back, but it was different now. There was something deeper, more certain in it. "Not yet. Still waiting for things to unfold." Jeanette's eyes sparkled with an understanding that Margaret appreciated. Jeanette had always seen through the pretense, always been sharp enough to spot the quiet strength Margaret had kept hidden for so long. The two women had spent years chatting in the corner of that small-town cafe, Margaret slowly coming to terms with what she had allowed herself to endure, and Jeanette always nudging her toward a stronger path. "You always had power, Margaret," Jeanette said with a knowing grin. "You just forgot to use it." Margaret met her eyes and let the words sit between them for a moment. There was no need to say anything more. They both knew what this meant. This wasn't just about money or assets. It was about reclaiming the authority that had been hers all along, the strength she had abandoned in the name of family. As the afternoon stretched on, Margaret moved to the large windows that overlooked the lush grounds of the estate. The vibrant greenery of the gardens outside contrasted sharply with the cold, sterile world she had just left behind. It felt different here, this place where respect wasn't earned, it was simply given. But the thought of Carolyn, of how she would respond to the letter, to the loss of the silent support she had always taken for granted, kept pulling at her. There would be anger, of course, but anger was a temporary thing. The real question was, what would be left after the anger faded? Would Carolyn even realize what she had lost? Would she regret what she had pushed her mother to do? Margaret sighed, a slow, reflective breath. It didn't matter. The decision had been made. And it was final. The door to the suite opened again, and a young staff member stepped inside, holding a tray with a folded piece of paper on top. "Ms. Baxter," she said, her voice quiet but respectful. "This just came for you." Margaret reached for the envelope without hesitation. She could feel the weight of it, thick with intention. She tore it open, unfolding the contents. The words were brief, but they carried a heavy sting. "We need to talk. This isn't over." Carolyn had finally responded. Margaret folded the paper carefully, her lips pressing together in a thin line. She didn't need to read it again. She had known what was coming, and she was ready. The game was just beginning. The early morning light streamed through the large windows of Margaret's suite, casting soft shadows on the freshly made bed. She had woken before dawn, the letter from Carolyn still in her mind, but it was the silence that had settled over her that felt the heaviest. Carolyn's response had been exactly what Margaret had expected, but still, it didn't ease the weight that pressed down on her chest. She hadn't replied to the text. "Can we talk?" And didn't plan to. She had been the one to listen, the one to quietly carry everything for too long. Now it was Carolyn's turn to feel the weight of silence. Margaret wasn't angry. Not anymore. She had already given everything she had in the past. Now, she was giving herself. As the morning passed, Margaret turned her attention elsewhere. She needed to fill the space around her with something more than just thoughts of family. A distraction, a reminder that she was still here and had a purpose beyond the role she had been expected to play for so many years. A knock came at the door. "Ms. Baxter?" A young staff member stepped inside, carrying a small bouquet of fresh flowers. "The garden club meeting is about to start. Will you be attending?" Margaret stood up from the armchair where she had been reading, smoothing her skirt as she smiled politely. "Yes, I'll be there shortly. Thank you." Margaret had spent the past few days settling in, getting to know the other residents, but today felt different. She was no longer the newcomer. Today, she was a participant, a leader. She wasn't sure how or why, but the thought of being part of something, of taking up space in this new life, stirred something in her. She was ready for whatever came next. The room where the garden club met was bathed in soft sunlight. Lush plants adorned every corner, filling the air with the scent of fresh flowers. Margaret moved toward the table where a nameplate sat for her, neatly arranged next to a glass of iced tea. She had been given her own space, her own seat, something she hadn't had in so long. She was greeted by the curious eyes of the other women, their polite smiles barely hiding their interest. There was no need for pleasantries now. Margaret had earned her place in this world simply by being here. She had made her decision, and now it was time to see where it would lead. Margaret settled into her seat, feeling the eyes of the room on her. They hadn't yet had the chance to speak, to fully know who she was, but they would soon enough. They had no choice. She was no longer a peripheral figure. She was the one at the center. The woman sitting next to her, a tall woman with silver hair, leaned over and asked, "Did your kids kick you out, or just forget you were there?" The question was blunt, but it wasn't unkind. It was the kind of question only someone who truly understood could ask. Margaret paused for a moment before answering, her voice steady and calm. "A little of both," she replied with a faint smile. "But I'm not forgettable anymore." The table fell silent for a moment. Margaret could see the other women's eyes flicking to each other, but there was no judgment. Just curiosity, maybe even a hint of admiration. These women, who had lived long enough to know what silence and sacrifice looked like, understood something she hadn't realized before. This wasn't a story of loss. It was a story of reclaiming. Jeanette arrived just as the meeting started to wind down, taking the seat next to Margaret. A glass of wine was already in her hand, a small smile playing on her lips. "Well, that went well," Jeanette said, her tone low. almost teasing. Margaret turned to her, a knowing smile curling at the corners of her lips. "It's fine. They'll get used to me." Jeanette raised an eyebrow. "Oh, they will. And they'll start whispering about you, too. You know how that goes." Margaret nodded. She had already heard the whispers. She had felt their curious eyes on her, but it didn't matter. They weren't on her account. Not anymore. Jeanette leaned in slightly, her voice dropping. "I've heard some things from the staff about the estate. They're talking, Margaret. Word's getting around. Your daughter's not exactly handling things well. The letter? The one you left? She's furious." Margaret's lips tightened briefly, but she didn't flinch. "Let them talk. It's not their business. They're not on my account." Jeanette's smile widened, the faintest trace of mischief in her eyes. "That's exactly why I like you, Margaret. You've got more power than you realize." Margaret let the words sink in as she looked out the window, her eyes resting on the lush garden below. A soft breeze fluttered through the trees, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Everything was shifting, and it was all happening now, in real time. Later that night, as Margaret sat alone in her suite, the phone rang again, breaking the evening silence. This time, it wasn't Carolyn. It wasn't Ethan. It was Louis. "Margaret," he said, his voice urgent but calm. "I've received a request from Ethan. He's asking about reconsidering the trust terms. He wants to meet." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. She could almost feel the tension in the air, stretching out over the miles between them. Ethan was making his move, too little, too late. Her lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Let him try," she said, the words slipping out without hesitation. "But it won't change anything." And just like that, Margaret knew that the game was no longer in their hands. It was in hers. The crisp scent of fresh flowers filled the lobby of Churchill Estates as Margaret watched from across the room. She had been anticipating this moment since the first silence had settled between her and Carolyn, since the letter had been left and the decision had been made. Carolyn appeared in the doorway, standing uncertainly for a moment before stepping forward, clutching a bouquet of gaudy grocery store roses. They were far from the elegant, arranged displays Margaret had grown accustomed to seeing in the lobby, but the gesture was clear. A last-ditch attempt at something: apology, guilt, perhaps even an invitation back into the fold. But for all their bright colors, the flowers felt cheap, fragile, and faded already, their petals almost too heavy for their stems. Margaret remained seated in the plush armchair by the window, one leg crossed over the other, her posture as composed as ever. She had been waiting for this, and now that it was here, the anxiety she might have felt seemed to slip away like a forgotten memory. This wasn't about reconciliation. This was about closure. Her fingers gently rested on the cool surface of the glass coffee table in front of her. She didn't stand. She didn't move. Carolyn approached, her eyes searching the room until they landed on Margaret. There was no warmth in her gaze, only something hard, a mixture of hurt and indignation. She held out the flowers in an awkward gesture, but Margaret didn't take them. Instead, she lifted her eyes slowly to meet her daughter's. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything that had been said, unsaid, and left to linger hung thick between them. Finally, Carolyn broke the silence, her voice tight but wavering. "This isn't how I wanted things to go," she said, her eyes searching Margaret's face for some sign of forgiveness, some crack in the armor she had built. Margaret's lips curled slightly, a small but deliberate smile. "You told me to leave," she replied, her voice calm, the words smooth like velvet but cutting just the same. "I just did it with style." The tension in Carolyn's face deepened, and for a moment there was a flash of guilt in her eyes, almost like she realized too late the gravity of what she had done. but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a defensiveness that stung. "I didn't mean," Carolyn began, but Margaret interrupted her, her voice steady and unwavering. "You screamed it." The words hung in the air, final, cutting through the fragile veneer of politeness Carolyn had been clinging to. "And now you're here with flowers, as if that's going to undo what's been done." Carolyn flinched, the flowers in her hand slipping ever so slightly. She opened her mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. She had no real defense, no words that could explain away what had already been said. The reality of her actions had settled into the space between them, and no amount of plastic-wrapped roses could erase the bitterness. Margaret stood up slowly, not out of any desire to comfort or engage, but to let Carolyn see her fully. To let her understand the magnitude of the distance between them now. She wasn't going back. There was no return ticket. Before Carolyn could respond, Jeanette appeared at Margaret's side, her presence like a steadying hand on a delicate moment. She had seen the whole exchange, standing at a distance, her arms crossed, her gaze one of quiet approval. "Your mother's booked through winter," Jeanette said, her voice light but dripping with knowing. She was well aware of the undercurrent of drama, of the conversations that had already started to circle within the walls of the estate. "And I think that's about all the time she needs to figure out what she wants. Don't you think?" Carolyn's face went pale, the sudden realization that Margaret wasn't going anywhere, seeping into her expression. She had come here expecting an apology or perhaps a moment of reconciliation, but what she found was something entirely different. Margaret wasn't just leaving her old life behind. She was building a new one where Carolyn's influence no longer held any sway. Margaret didn't look at Carolyn as she turned to Jeanette. She didn't need to. "You're right," Margaret replied, her voice smooth and composed. "I'll need more than winter. I'm just getting started." Jeanette's lips curled into a small smile, pleased by Margaret's calm certainty. The women's quiet exchange wasn't lost on Carolyn, though. She looked between them, her face flushed with frustration and something deeper. Regret, maybe. Or fear. She was no longer the one in control, and that realization stung far more than any words Margaret could have said. Margaret took a moment to let the silence settle, allowing the full weight of her presence to fill the space. She wasn't the invisible woman who quietly obeyed anymore. She was the woman who had made her decision and would no longer be erased. Carolyn, for the first time, seemed to realize it. As the tension thickened, Margaret turned toward the door, signaling the end of the conversation. "Thank you for the flowers, Carolyn," she said, her voice polite but final. "But I don't need them anymore." Carolyn stood frozen for a moment, her hand still extended, the flowers now looking even more fragile in her grip. The faint, bittersweet scent of roses filled the air, but it didn't offer her comfort. The flowers had wilted too fast. And now she had nothing left to offer but her own silence. Margaret walked away, her steps measured, every move a clear statement that she was in control of her life now. The life she had almost lost, the life she was reclaiming. And in the quiet of that lobby, Margaret knew it. Carolyn's chapter in her story had ended. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Margaret's suite, casting a warm glow on the polished wooden floors. She sat at the small writing desk, her fingers lightly grazing the edge of a thick envelope. Inside was the document that had the power to change everything. Again. It wasn't the first time she'd held it, but today, it felt heavier, more final than before. She took a slow breath, letting the silence of the room settle around her before opening the envelope. The paper inside was crisp, the text a sharp reminder of what she had held on to, quietly, for years. A notarized document, transferring the original home ownership solely back to Margaret Baxter. Her name, in bold on the top of the page, confirming what Carolyn had never known, that Margaret had always been the one in control. Margaret leaned back in her chair, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. She'd known this moment would come. She had known for a long time. But it hadn't been about revenge, not really. It had been about reclaiming her place, her identity. Her mind drifted back to a time when it had all started, when everything had seemed so much simpler. A memory began to take shape, her husband's voice, soft and loving, echoing in her mind. Flashback. It was a rainy afternoon in the mid-90s, the kind of day where the sky seemed to stretch endlessly, a gray veil over everything. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, listening as her husband, James, went over the numbers. He'd just received his pension funds, a modest sum, but enough to make a significant dent in their dream of buying a house. "We'll need to get approved for the mortgage first," James had said, his voice steady as he flipped through a stack of papers. "But, with your name on the loan, I think we'll have a shot. We've got the income now. Just need to make sure we can cover the rest." Margaret had smiled then, her eyes crinkling at the corners. They hadn't had much, but they had each other. They had dreams, big ones, about the house they'd one day own. Margaret had agreed to put her name on the mortgage, signing the papers without hesitation. She trusted James with everything. He was the one who had always taken the lead. But what he didn't know, what neither of them could have predicted, was that she would one day be the one holding the reins. Now, in the present, Margaret set the document down and let out a long breath. She hadn't removed her name from the mortgage over the years, not once, even when the house had become their home, not just her home. She had stayed silent, letting them live there, rent-free. She had allowed Carolyn and Ethan to take advantage of her generosity, all while knowing she still legally owned 50% of the property. Margaret stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the expansive gardens below. The air was crisp, the landscape peaceful, a stark contrast to the storm she was about to unleash. The phone rang, breaking her thoughts. It was Louis. "Margaret." His voice was smooth, authoritative. "I've filed the papers. Everything's set. There's no question about your ownership of the property. Carolyn is listed as a secondary beneficiary, but she doesn't hold the deed. You still legally own 50% of the house. You can force them out, if you wish." Margaret's fingers tightened around the phone, but her expression remained unchanged. She had never been the one to act impulsively, to let her emotions dictate her decisions. She'd done the hard work of waiting, of letting things unfold in their own time. Now, she was simply putting the final pieces into place. She exhaled slowly. "Thank you, Louis," she said softly. "It's good to have options." Later that day, Margaret sat in the common room, sipping her tea, the weight of the papers still resting heavily in her mind. Her phone buzzed, a message from Jeanette. "Jeanette. Just heard. Carolyn and Ethan are panicking. Word's out. They have no idea what's coming." Margaret smiled, her fingers tracing the edge of the cup. She could almost feel the tension from miles away, but it didn't bother her. Not anymore. Just as she set her phone down, there was a soft knock on her door. Margaret didn't need to ask who it was. She knew. "Come in," she called, her voice calm, her posture still. The door opened slowly and Ethan stepped in, his face pale, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He looked as though he had aged years in the past few days, his shoulders slumped as if carrying the weight of the world. "I need to talk to you," Ethan said, his voice strained. "About the house." Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't feel the need to move toward him, to meet him halfway. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You can try to fight it, Ethan," she said, her voice smooth, steady. But you won't win. Ethan swallowed hard, his gaze flickering nervously. She's going to force us out, isn't she? She's going to take the house back. Margaret's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. No, she said, her voice almost a whisper. I'm not going to take it. I'm going to let you keep the cold shoulders, but I'll take the bricks. The words hung in the air, a quiet promise. The game was over for them. The cards were in her hands, and she was no longer afraid to play them. Ethan stood frozen, the weight of Margaret's words sinking into him like a stone in still water. He had always thought he could control the situation, always thought his quiet indifference would shield him. But now he saw, too late, that Margaret was no longer someone to be overlooked. She was the one who held the power. The morning air was thick with the promise of change as the assessor stepped carefully through the Baxter family home. His presence was clinical, professional. Everything about him screamed detachment as he moved through the house with practiced precision. The floors creaked under his steps, the walls whispering of the years that had passed, but it was all just another day for him. He wasn't here to feel. He was here to record. Carolyn stood in the doorway of the living room, her arms crossed tightly, watching as he snapped photos of the old wooden staircase, the polished marble of the foyer, the kitchen counters where her children had spilled cereal for years. Her eyes followed every movement he made, her jaw tightening with every flash of his camera. This was not just a house to her. This was the house, and it was slipping away. Is this really necessary? Carolyn's voice broke through the stillness of the room, her words laced with frustration and desperation. This house is ours. Margaret can't. The assessor didn't even glance up as he adjusted his camera. Margaret Baxter requested a full appraisal, he said, his tone even, indifferent. He continued taking notes, his pen moving across the page with a rhythm that Carolyn could only find maddening. Do you think she's really going to follow through? Carolyn asked, her voice sharper now. She could feel her nerves fraying, her sense of control slipping away like sand through her fingers. This is just a formality, right? She's just trying to scare us. The assessor paused for a fraction of a second, glancing up at her with a small shrug. I don't know what she's planning, but the paperwork's all in order. There's no question about the value of this property, and the fact that she still legally owns half of it, well, that's what we're here to assess. The finality in his words settled into the room like cold air. Carolyn's face flushed with a mix of disbelief and mounting panic. The thought of losing everything she had taken for granted, the house, the lifestyle, the power over Margaret, was unbearable. And yet, here it was, slipping through her fingers. Ethan entered the room quietly, his eyes wary, his steps hesitant. He'd been pacing upstairs, trying to make sense of the mounting pressure that had begun to crack the foundation of his calm exterior. When he saw the assessor, a sudden realization flickered in his eyes. Why didn't we see this coming? He muttered to no one in particular. Carolyn shot him a look, but her words were sharper, more focused. She was always planning this, Ethan. She didn't even tell us. Just quietly took control when we weren't paying attention. And now, she gestured vaguely toward the assessor, her hand trembling in the air. The assessor was moving toward the back of the house now, making his way through the darkened hallway. He barely acknowledged their exchange. He didn't have to. He was just here to record facts, not emotions. Facts. The numbers. The appraisals. Ethan exhaled, his face flushed with frustration. She's playing us, Carolyn. She always has. We thought we had control, but she's always been one step ahead. Margaret had been the invisible force behind the scenes, the quiet player who bided her time, while Carolyn and Ethan had been too focused on their own ambitions to see what was coming. Now, it was too late to change the game. Carolyn moved toward the kitchen, leaning against the counter, her arms crossed tightly. "What do we do now?" she asked, almost to herself. She didn't know if she was asking Ethan or the universe. It didn't matter anymore. The house, the family, everything was slipping away, and she had no control over it. Margaret sat at her desk later that afternoon, the weight of her decision settling into her chest as she looked at the papers before her. She had taken the necessary steps, but this was about more than just legalities. It was about creating something lasting. Her gaze shifted to the framed photograph on her desk, the photo of Jeanette and the two of them sitting side by side in the garden, smiles shared over tea. It had been a simple afternoon, but it had sparked something in Margaret, a realization that her legacy could be more than just surviving. Her hand hovered over her updated will, the legal paper almost symbolic. She was no longer just a mother, a wife, a dutiful daughter. She had the ability to change things on her own terms, to ensure that her wealth would go towards something meaningful. She didn't hesitate. The ink flowed smoothly across the page as she updated her will to allocate assets to educational charities and Jeanette's literacy fund. It felt right. It felt like a reclaiming of her time, her resources, and, most importantly, her future. Later that week, Margaret attended the next garden club meeting, her posture straight, her confidence palpable. As the meeting progressed, she was nominated and elected to the spring leadership team, a gesture that felt like the culmination of everything she had worked toward. A seat at the table, a voice in the room, no longer an afterthought. When the announcement was made, the other women turned toward her, some with polite applause, others with genuine admiration. But there was no hiding the new truth that was unfolding around her. Margaret was here to stay, and she wasn't going anywhere. Jeanette leaned in, her eyes sparkling with the same quiet mischief they always held. "You always thought small, Margaret," she whispered. "Now you're playing big." Margaret let the words sink in as she looked out at the room of women, some nodding in acknowledgement, others offering tentative smiles. The shift was undeniable. For the first time in years, Margaret felt truly seen, not just as Carolyn's mother, not as a forgotten figure, but as a woman with power, influence, and a purpose of her own. As the meeting continued, Margaret knew the storm was far from over. Carolyn would fight. Ethan would crack under the pressure. But they had already lost. Margaret had outlasted them, and now she was the one setting the course for the future. And this time it was her legacy that would endure. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm orange glow over the perfectly manicured gardens at Churchill Estates. Margaret walked slowly along the winding path, the soft crunch of gravel beneath her feet, providing a rhythmic accompaniment to her thoughts. She had grown accustomed to this peaceful solitude, the constant hum of life around her, and yet, today, there was something different in the air, something sharp, like the calm before the storm. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the quiet stillness of the afternoon. She pulled it out without a second thought, expecting another routine update from Jeanette or one of the staff. But when she saw the sender's name, her pulse quickened. Lewis Caldwell. The message was short and to the point. "The documents are signed. Your lease proposal is ready for delivery." Margaret stopped in her tracks, letting the words sink in. She had already taken the legal steps. The game had changed, and now the final move was in motion. She wasn't forcing anyone out, not yet. But the clock was ticking, and the ball was in their court. Her thoughts shifted back to the last conversation with Carolyn, her daughter's frantic phone calls, the tears, the endless attempts to play the victim. It was always the same, Carolyn blaming everyone but herself. But this time, Margaret wouldn't play along. She had drawn her line, and it wasn't going to move. Later that evening, the letter arrived. Lewis had been precise as always. The proposal was in black and white, clear, unambiguous. The lease offered Carolyn and Ethan one last chance. Start paying market rent or prepare to vacate within 30 days. Margaret didn't flinch when the paper landed on her desk. She knew exactly what it meant. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The quiet resolve she'd found in this place, this new life, had given her the courage to do what she'd never done before. Act without hesitation. She was no longer the woman who asked for permission, who quietly endured. No. Now, she was the one calling the shots, making the decisions. The power was hers, and she intended to keep it that way. Back at the house, Carolyn's panic was palpable. The moment she read the lease proposal, she froze. The house, their house, was no longer theirs. The control, the comfort, it was all slipping away. Ethan tried to console her, his face drained of color, his voice tinged with disbelief. "She's not bluffing, Carolyn," he said, the words more of a confirmation than a statement. "She's really doing this." Carolyn stood still, her hands trembling as she held the paper. Her eyes flickered to the corner of the room where the once familiar family portraits hung, her family, her legacy. And now, it was all being ripped from her. Her breath hitched as she slowly crumpled the lease in her hands. "She's nuking us," Carolyn muttered, her voice cracking. Ethan remained silent. His gaze fell to the ground, a mixture of helplessness and anger clouding his thoughts. But the truth was, they had seen this coming. They had just chosen not to believe it. Margaret had been silent, but she had always been watching. Now, she had the power to decide their fate. As Margaret continued her walk through the garden, her mind was sharp and clear, the weight of the past few weeks finally lifting from her shoulders. Jeanette caught up with her smile wide as she slowed her pace to match Margaret's. "Today's the day, isn't it?" Jeanette asked, her voice filled with quiet amusement. Margaret nodded, her eyes scanning the rows of vibrant flowers, the serenity of the space around her contrasting with the storm raging back at the Baxter home. "It's the day I take back everything that was always mine," she replied, her voice calm but firm. Jeanette's eyes sparkled with approval. "You always thought small, Margaret," she said, a hint of admiration in her voice. "Now you're playing big." Margaret smiled, the words resonating deeper than Jeanette could know. She had always lived in the shadows of others, her husband's ambitions, her children's needs. But now, she had stepped into the light. She was no longer an afterthought. She wasn't just a mother, a widow, or a forgotten woman. She was Margaret Baxter, and this was her moment. As they walked, Margaret let herself enjoy the silence. She had spent so many years running on autopilot, just trying to keep the peace, just trying to survive. But now, she was thriving. Her phone buzzed again. A quick glance at the screen, and Margaret's smile widened. It was an email from Aubrey, her granddaughter. "Aubrey, can we see you without them? I miss you." The words hit her with unexpected warmth. She hadn't realized how much she had missed this connection. It wasn't just the house, the money, or the legacy that mattered now. It was the people who saw her for who she really was, the ones who didn't try to manipulate or control her. Margaret tapped out a quick reply, her fingers steady as she typed. "Come visit any time. The guest suite is yours always." She hit send and put her phone away. The future was uncertain, but for the first time Margaret felt the thrill of possibilities stretching out before her. She wasn't going to let fear or anyone else define her anymore. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, she realized that no matter what happened, she had finally taken control. And nothing at all, could take that away from her. The pen glided across the paper with quiet authority, the sound barely audible above the steady hum of conversation in the Churchill administrative office. Margaret sat at the polished oak desk, posture straight, eyes clear. In front of her was a form stamped in bold at the top, "Durable power of attorney." "Final confirmation, Ms. Baxter," Claire said softly, leaning over the desk. Claire was efficient and meticulous, the kind of administrator who handled high-end clients with precision and a calm smile. Your new power of attorney will be legally binding by the end of the day. Margaret didn't hesitate. Make it Jeanette Cole, she said. Her voice was even, but there was a quiet strength beneath it, a certainty that didn't need explanation. Claire's pen paused midair. Jeanette, your friend from the garden club? Margaret nodded. She's earned the title. A small smile tugged at the corners of Claire's mouth as she noted it down. And your executor remains Mr. Caldwell? Yes, Margaret replied. Lewis handles the details. Jeanette handles me. It wasn't meant as a joke, but Claire laughed softly anyway, sensing the wit in the words. Margaret smiled faintly in return. It felt good to be understood. Not pitied, not dismissed, just understood. Claire flipped through a new stack of documents. I'll also update your preferred doctors and financial institutions. Dr. Hayes, you said? And you wanted us to add Ridgefield Investments to your accounts list? That's correct, Margaret said, signing where needed. She was deliberate in her movements, her penmanship neat and practiced. Each signature felt like a quiet strike of independence. With every line she signed, she could feel the residue of Carolyn's control, her subtle manipulations being wiped clean. She wasn't erasing her daughter from her life. She was erasing her from the decisions that no longer concerned her. When she finished, Claire gathered the papers, aligning them perfectly into a single, crisp folder. We'll send copies to your lawyer and keep one on file here, she said, her tone respectful. You're all set, Ms. Baxter. Margaret leaned back in her chair, exhaling softly. It was done. That afternoon, when she returned to her suite, a bouquet of white lilies awaited her on the table, an elegant arrangement from the garden club. A small card, handwritten in looping script, was tucked among the stems. For Grace, under fire. Margaret smiled. She admired the sentiment, though the truth behind it ran deeper than most people could see. She walked to her writing desk, pulled out a single piece of stationery, and began to write her reply. It's easier to hold grace when you drop the weight of apology. She paused, then added a small flourish beneath her name before sealing the envelope. She didn't mean it as defiance, it was simply truth. Grace had become her armor. Later that evening, as dusk softened the edges of the world, Margaret sat by the window, the faint scent of rain drifting through the open pane. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. She reached for it, expecting another message from Jeanette, but instead saw a notification from the concierge desk. A letter has arrived for you. Curious, she went to retrieve it. The handwriting on the envelope was instantly familiar. Rounded, careful, the kind of cursive taught in middle school. Sadie. Margaret's lips parted in surprise as she unfolded the note inside. The ink was slightly smudged, likely from the nervous hand of a teenager trying to say something that mattered. Grandma, I miss the pancakes. They never taste the same when Mom makes them. I think she burns them on purpose. I wish you were still here on Sundays. Margaret felt a pinch of emotion behind her ribs. It wasn't pain. It was something more complicated. Longing, perhaps. Hope. Sadie had always been the quiet one, the one who watched without judgment, who still slipped her hand into Margaret's at the movies long after she'd outgrown it. She set the note on her lap and looked out at the gardens. The magnolias were in bloom again, their scent drifting through the air like memory. She picked up her pen, opened a fresh envelope, and began to write. My door opens when yours opens from love, not pressure. That's how it should be. And Sadie, pancakes taste better when you flip them early. You'll see when you visit. She added a small smiley face at the bottom, a detail Sadie would notice immediately, and tucked the note into a small package she'd already been assembling. A new spatula, a bottle of vanilla extract, and a handwritten recipe card titled Sunday Morning Pancakes. She sealed the box and set it by the door, ready to send first thing in the morning. As the evening deepened, Jeanette knocked and stepped inside, holding 2 glasses of wine. "You've been busy," she teased, glancing at the papers still spread across the table. Margaret chuckled softly. "Just cleaning house in a different way." Jeanette handed her a glass and raised her own. "To freedom in ink and fine print." Margaret clinked hers gently, to knowing when to stop apologizing. They drank, the quiet between them comfortable. Outside, the lamps along the garden path flickered to life, casting warm halos over the flowers. Margaret felt a peace she hadn't known in years, the kind that came when every tether had been cut, every unnecessary weight released. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even vengeful. She was done. But as Jeanette turned to leave, Margaret's phone buzzed again. This time, an unfamiliar number flashing across the screen. She hesitated, staring at it for a long moment. Then, with a quiet breath, she pressed open. The message was just 3 words. "It's not over." Margaret's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing slightly. The warmth of the moment thinned. She looked toward the window, where the reflection of her own calm face stared back. Stronger, wiser, unshaken. "No," she whispered to herself, setting the phone down. "It isn't." And outside, the magnolias swayed in the wind, their petals falling like pieces of an old life finally letting go. The phone rang just after 9, its sound breaking through the quiet rhythm of Margaret's morning. She was standing by the balcony window, cup of tea in hand, watching the soft drizzle blur the manicured lawns below. The rain gave everything a silver sheen, the kind of calm that only came after chaos had already done its work. She set her cup down, reached for the phone, and froze for a moment at the name flashing on the screen. Ethan Rhodes. She hadn't heard his voice since the day he'd stood in her doorway, trying to make sense of his wife's unraveling composure. The last few weeks had been a blur of silence punctuated by legal motions and whispers passed through Lewis. The silence had suited her, but something in her chest stirred as she answered. "Ethan." There was a pause on the other end. The faint sound of wind, a car engine idling. Then his voice. Steady, but weighted. "We're listing the house." Margaret didn't speak. She could hear him exhale, the tired sigh of a man who had finally run out of options. "You win," he said. For a brief second, Margaret almost laughed, not out of cruelty, but out of disbelief. Win. As though this had been a contest, as though dignity, respect, and independence could be tallied on a scoreboard. "I wasn't playing," she said softly. Another pause. Rain tapped lightly against her window, the sound filling the silence that stretched between them. "I know," Ethan said finally. His tone carried something that surprised her. Not resentment, but resignation. "Carolyn's angry, but she knows we can't keep it. Between the mortgage and the new terms, it's over. We'll be out by next month." Margaret closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. There was no satisfaction in hearing them, only release. She hadn't wanted their failure. She had simply stopped underwriting it. "I'm sorry it came to this," Ethan added quietly. Margaret looked out toward the dripping magnolia trees. "So am I. But I didn't make it come to this. I just stopped pretending it hadn't already." He didn't argue. There was only the sound of soft static, followed by a slow exhale. "I'll make sure the place is ready for whatever you want to do with it. I'll take care of that much." She almost said thank you for finally doing something, but the words died on her tongue. Instead, she said, simply, "Thank you," and ended the call. The screen went black. Margaret stood still for a moment, listening to the silence in her suite, the low hum of the refrigerator, the muffled chatter of staff in the hallway. She had imagined this moment so many times, victory, maybe even vindication. But now that it was here, it felt quiet, balanced. She picked up her tea again, though it had long since gone cold. Jeanette arrived unannounced, a splash of color in her bright red raincoat and umbrella that dripped all over the marble floor. "You're impossible to surprise," she said with a grin, shaking off the rain. "I saw your lawyer leaving the main office. I thought I'd check if your world's still spinning on your terms." Margaret smiled faintly. "For once, I think it is." Jeanette set her umbrella aside and plopped onto the armchair across from her. "So, what's the latest from Camp Chaos?" Margaret turned the phone toward her, the call log still open. "Ethan called." Jeanette raised a brow. "Well, that's new. What did the brave soldier have to say?" "They're listing the house," Margaret said, her voice steady. Jeanette's eyes widened, then she let out a low whistle. "About damn time." She leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "They never saw you coming." Margaret tilted her head slightly, the ghost of a smile forming. "I never needed to be seen," she said, her tone almost reflective. "I needed to be respected." The words hung in the air, heavier than she expected them to. They weren't bitter. They were true. And in that truth, there was freedom. Jeanette studied her for a moment, her smirk softening into something gentler. "You've changed, you know. The woman I met last year would have apologized for everything, even her own reflection." Margaret laughed quietly. "And now?" "Now," Jeanette said, reaching for the teapot on the side table. "You're the reflection." They sat in companionable silence as the rain eased into a mist. The soft patter against the windows blended with the hum of distant conversation from the corridor. Margaret felt a lightness inside her, a quiet confidence that had replaced years of restraint. She wasn't the woman Carolyn could command. She wasn't the mother who waited to be thanked. She was a woman who had rebuilt her world, on her own terms. As Jeanette poured 2 cups of tea, the phone buzzed again. Both women glanced toward it. The number was new, unfamiliar. Margaret hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly as she reached for the device. Another anonymous text appeared, the same tone as before, short, deliberate. "You've made your point. Now what?" Jeanette caught the change in Margaret's expression. "Who is it?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked out toward the dripping garden, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. Calm, composed, unbreakable. Then she set the phone face down and said quietly, "Now? Now I build something they can't take back." Outside, the rain stopped completely. The first beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, spreading across the glass like gold. And for the first time in a very long time, Margaret Baxter felt the day was finally hers. The camera flash startled Margaret more than she expected. She blinked against the bright light, then adjusted her posture, hands folded loosely in front of her as the reporter from the Springfield Chronicle asked, "What made you decide to do it?" She stood in front of the Baxter house, the house that had once been a battlefield, a symbol of tension, pride, and silence. Now, the morning sun caught the new brass plaque beside the porch steps. The Baxter House, transitional housing for grandmothers raising grandchildren. Margaret glanced at the words before answering. "It wasn't really a decision," she said softly. "It was a release." The reporter lowered his microphone slightly, watching her, sensing there was more she wasn't saying. But Margaret didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The story would speak for itself. Behind her, a moving van rumbled away from the curb, leaving behind the 2 women who would call this house home. Betty Harris, age 68, with her 5-year-old granddaughter clutching her hand, and Lorna White, 71, unpacking a box marked "Dishes, Fragile." The laughter of children drifted from the yard where 2 little boys chased each other across the lawn. It sounded like life again. Margaret smiled faintly and stepped aside to let the women through the doorway. One of them touched her arm as she passed. "Thank you," Betty whispered, her voice trembling. Margaret's fingers closed gently over the woman's hand. "Make it yours," she said. The reporter caught that exchange, scribbling it down quickly. Within 24 hours, the story would run with a headline that made even Jeanette laugh: "Woman turns family feud into community shelter." That evening, Margaret sat on the terrace at Churchill, watching the sunset smear the sky in bands of pink and gold. The air carried the faint scent of lilac from the gardens below, mingling with the murmur of conversation from nearby tables. Jeanette arrived, as she always did, with 2 glasses of wine and a grin that could melt granite. "You're officially famous," she announced, plopping the evening paper onto the table. Margaret glanced at the front page. Her photograph, standing beside the sign, her silver hair caught in sunlight, took up half the column. She looked older than she felt, but stronger too. "They make me sound like I planned it for years," Margaret said dryly. Jeanette chuckled. "You kind of did. Even if you didn't know it." Margaret smiled, tilting her head as she read the caption under the photo. "Margaret Baxter, 72, repurposes her former home into a safe haven for displaced grandmothers and their families." She set the paper aside. "It feels strange," she admitted quietly. "For so long, that house was a weight. Now it's a gift?" Jeanette finished for her. Margaret nodded. "One they can't take back. Or ruin." Jeanette raised her glass, her eyes glinting with admiration. "You've become a legacy in flats and cardigans." Margaret laughed, shaking her head. "I was never just someone's mother," she said, her tone light but threaded with something deeper. "I just forgot to remind the world." Jeanette leaned forward. "And now?" "Now," Margaret said, gazing out toward the gardens where dusk had begun to settle. "The world remembers me exactly the way I want it to." They clinked glasses softly, the sound sharp and satisfying in the warm air. A week later, the garden club gathered in the Churchill Ballroom for their annual spring fundraiser. The room shimmered with soft light, the tables draped in pale linen, centerpieces blooming with roses and tulips. At the front of the room, a banner read, "Honoring Margaret Baxter for turning loss into shelter." As she entered, a wave of applause rippled through the crowd. Margaret paused, caught off guard. It wasn't the polite, tepid applause of social obligation. It was warm, genuine. Jeanette was the first to greet her, linking an arm through hers. "You know," she whispered, "this place hasn't clapped that hard since someone spiked the punch at the Christmas banquet." Margaret laughed softly, but her eyes glistened. She wasn't used to being celebrated, at least not for herself. Not like this. She accepted the small plaque they handed her, engraved simply, "For grace, courage, and renewal." Margaret didn't make a speech. She didn't need to. When someone called for a few words, she smiled and said, "I spent most of my life trying not to make noise, but sometimes silence can speak loud enough." The room went quiet. Even Jeanette, for once, didn't quip. Later, after the music faded and the tables had emptied, Margaret and Jeanette stepped out into the cool night. The air was clear, the stars sharp above them. "Do you ever think she'll understand?" Jeanette asked quietly. Margaret didn't have to ask who she meant. "Maybe," she said, "but that's not the point anymore." They walked in silence for a moment, the crunch of gravel underfoot. Then Margaret stopped and looked up at the night sky, the faintest smile touching her lips. "Some things," she said, "you build for the people who come after you, not the ones who walked away." Jeanette studied her friend's face, the calm certainty there. "You really are unstoppable, you know that?" Margaret turned toward her, that familiar glint of wit back in her eyes. "No," she said. I'm just finally moving without permission. As they walked back toward the glow of the estate, a distant sound carried on the breeze, the laughter of children, faint but unmistakable. Margaret paused, listening. It came from the direction of the old house. She smiled, tears catching the light. The home she'd built had found its voice again, and this time it was full of life. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, and unmarked. No return address, but Margaret didn't need one. The handwriting was unmistakable, tight, deliberate, the way Carolyn used to write thank you notes as a child, each letter pressed too hard into the paper as if she could force sincerity through pressure alone. It arrived on a quiet afternoon. The sun was streaming through the window of her suite, glinting off the glass frames on her desk, the plaque from the garden club, a photo of the grandkids taken years ago, and a smaller one of her and Jeanette laughing in the cafe. Margaret turned the envelope over in her hands, thumb brushing the edge of the flap. There was no apprehension, no dread, only curiosity. She sliced it open neatly with the silver letter opener Lewis had given her as a joke gift. For official declarations of independence, he'd said. The first line was exactly what she expected. Mom, I don't know where to start. It was the kind of opening that sounded apologetic but wasn't. The kind that prepared the reader for a confession that never quite came. Margaret's eyes skimmed the page. The tone was careful, even mournful, but the rhythm was all Carolyn, sentences curving inward, circling pain without landing on it. I know things got out of hand. I know I said things I shouldn't have. But it's been hard, Mom. Harder than you realize. The kids are distant. Ethan's stressed about the move, and I feel like everything's been crumbling around me. You left at the worst possible time, when I needed help the most. Margaret exhaled through her nose, slow and steady. She could almost hear Carolyn's voice, measured, defensive, trying to shape the narrative just enough to earn sympathy without accountability. You've always been the strong one. I guess I assumed you'd always take care of things. I never meant for it to sound cruel. I just wanted, I don't know, space, maybe. I thought we'd find our way back. The words blurred for a moment, not from tears, but from the sheer weight of repetition. Margaret had heard these excuses all her life. You're stronger, Mom. You'll understand. You'll forgive. She folded the letter carefully, once down the center, then again, a small, precise square. Without ceremony, she opened the drawer of her desk and slid it into a slim folder labeled in her handwriting, unresolved. The sound of the drawer closing was soft, final. That evening, Jeanette appeared at her door with her usual 2 glasses of wine. Margaret had expected her. Jeanette always had a sixth sense for timing. She entered without asking, plopping onto the sofa and glancing toward the desk. You got something from her, didn't you? Jeanette asked, nodding toward the drawer. Margaret arched an eyebrow. You're terrifying. Please, I can smell drama through drywall. Jeanette took a sip. So? What did she say? Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression neutral. Exactly what I expected. Sorry, but not sorry. Everything's been hard, the economy's rough, parenting's a challenge, the usual song. Jeanette studied her. Any part of you tempted? Margaret looked toward the window, where the light had started to fade into evening. The gardens below shimmered with the last of the day's gold, peaceful and still. Only the part I already healed, she said quietly. Jeanette nodded, satisfied. That's a hell of a line, Baxter. Put that on your next garden club speech. Margaret laughed softly. I'll pass. One performance a lifetime is plenty. The night settled comfortably around them. Jeanette left after an hour, and Margaret found herself standing by the balcony door again. The world outside was bathed in soft lamplight, the same magnolia trees she'd come to love shifting in the breeze, petals scattered like memory. Her phone buzzed on the table. A text this time, not from Carolyn. Sadie, can I come visit by myself? Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep in the chest, warm and involuntary. Her fingers hovered over the screen for only a second before she typed back. Margaret. Yes. The guest suite has your name on it. She watched the message send, the little delivered bubble appearing at the bottom. There was no hesitation, no fear of what the visit might stir up. Sadie wasn't her mother. The girl didn't carry blame, only a quiet longing to reconnect. Margaret turned off the lamp and crossed the room, pausing by the desk once more. Her hand brushed the top of the drawer labeled unresolved, and she let her palm rest there for a moment. Some stories didn't need endings. Some simply needed to stop bleeding. She walked to the window, the glass cool beneath her fingertips. Down below, a young couple strolled the path, laughter echoing faintly in the night. For a moment, Margaret closed her eyes and listened. Peace didn't roar, she thought, it whispered. And tomorrow, her granddaughter would arrive to hear it too. The ballroom was brighter than Margaret preferred, every chandelier casting its own halo across the sea of round tables and polished silver. She sat near the front, hands resting lightly on her lap, listening as the garden club's president made the introductions. It was the annual Women of Renewal luncheon, the one she'd nearly skipped. But Jeanette had shown up at her door that morning armed with a lavender corsage, a pair of earrings, and a threat. If you don't go, I'll nominate you posthumously. Now, as applause rippled across the room and her name echoed from the microphone, Margaret rose. She walked slowly toward the podium, steadily, deliberately, each click of her low heels against the marble floor marking the quiet rhythm of a life reclaimed. When she reached the stage, the room hushed. 1,000 tiny breaths seemed to hold at once. Margaret adjusted the microphone, the soft buzz filling the silence. She didn't need to look at her notes. She had lived every word. Thank you, she began simply. Her voice was calm, low, unshaken. When I moved here last year, I thought I was closing a door. It turns out I was opening one. A few heads tilted. A woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes before Margaret had even begun the story. I learned something about being invisible, Margaret continued. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens gradually. A kindness that becomes expectation. A favor that becomes obligation. You wake up one day and you realize people see you, but they don't look at you. The murmurs in the room quieted completely. Jeanette, sitting near the back, leaned forward, elbows on the table, watching her friend unfold. Margaret's gaze swept the audience, not challenging, just steady. You can be erased in your own home and still redraw the map. You can build new walls, plant new gardens, and reclaim your name. It's not about revenge, it's about recognition of yourself, first and always. A silence followed so deep it felt like reverence. Then came the sound of hands, slow at first, then rising, spreading through the room like a tide. Applause, some polite, some tearful, but all real. Jeanette's clap was the loudest. By the next morning, Margaret's suite was filled with flowers. White hydrangeas from the garden club, yellow roses from Churchill staff, and, unexpectedly, lavender and cream tulips from the Baxter House shelter. The card read, "Thank you for giving us back the meaning of home." Margaret smiled as she set the card beside her tea. For once, her home wasn't full of things she had to manage or people she had to please. It was full of gratitude she hadn't asked for, and that made all the difference. Carolyn didn't call. She hadn't expected her to. There were still too many walls between them, too many truths neither was ready to confront. Margaret didn't feel anger anymore. She felt distance, and peace in that distance. She didn't need closure. She had continuity. Sadie arrived that weekend, her suitcase bumping noisily across the brick walkway, curls bouncing, a nervous excitement flickering across her face. Margaret opened the door before the knock landed. "Grandma!" Sadie's voice filled the hall like sunlight, and Margaret's chest warmed in a way no applause could touch. They spent the day baking, pancakes in the morning, scones by afternoon, laughter spilling between stories that bridged the months apart. Sadie told her about school, her art class, how her mom still burned toast but pretended it was rustic. Margaret listened, smiling, letting the details wash over her like a language she'd missed. Later, as the two sat on the balcony watching the late spring sunset bleed into soft blue, Sadie turned to her, hesitating. "Grandma?" "Yes, sweetheart?" "Why didn't you yell back that night?" Margaret looked out toward the horizon. The air was calm, heavy with the scent of rain and new blooms. For a long moment she didn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but sure. "Because yelling makes you smaller," she said. "I needed to grow." Sadie was silent for a moment, absorbing the words in that thoughtful way only children could. Then she leaned her head on Margaret's shoulder. "I think you did," she murmured. Margaret smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of her granddaughter's hair. "I think I did too." When Sadie had gone to bed, Margaret sat at her desk, the soft lamplight casting golden halos across the papers she no longer needed. Deeds, trusts, letters now filed and forgotten. Her eyes drifted toward the balcony doors, where the night shimmered faintly against the glass. Outside, the garden lights flickered on, catching the magnolia blossoms that swayed in the gentle wind. Her phone buzzed once on the table, a news alert about her speech. She ignored it. Some moments were meant to stay unrecorded. She leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and listened to the soft rhythm of Sadie's laughter drifting faintly from the next room, a reminder of all she'd lost and all she'd rebuilt. For the first time in years, Margaret Baxter didn't feel like she was standing on the edge of something. She was in it, rooted, steady, and entirely her own. But as the magnolias rustled outside, she sensed there was still one more step left in her story, one last gesture the world didn't yet see coming, and Margaret, ever deliberate, was already planning how to take it. The morning sun was soft and forgiving, wrapping the Churchill Gardens in a light that made everything seem newly washed, newly possible. Margaret walked slowly down the path, her hand grazing the low iron railing lined with rose bushes. The blooms were fresh, pale pink and deep crimson, fragrant even in the cool air. She had helped choose them last month, insisting on a mix that would bloom all season. "Life doesn't happen all at once," she'd told the gardener. "Neither should beauty." Now, as she moved through the path, she felt that truth under her feet. Each step was measured, deliberate, not from frailty, but reverence. This was the garden she had helped rebuild, funded in part by her donation, maintained by the Churchill residents. And today, it wasn't just a garden, it was a tribute. Near the center, beneath a willow whose leaves trailed like threads of light, two young girls were on their knees, gloved hands deep in the earth. Sadie and Aubrey, granddaughter and friend, were both intent on the task, their laughter soft but bright against the bird song. A small plaque sat ready on the stone nearby, wrapped in paper. Jeanette was directing them, her wide-brimmed hat tilted like a general's insignia. "A little more soil on that side, Sadie," she said, pretending to supervise while leaning far too comfortably on her spade. "The tree's going to grow lopsided if you plant it like that." "It's not," Sadie argued, pressing the soil firmly. "Grandma said you don't rush roots. They find their own balance." Margaret smiled. That sounded like her. When the girls were done, she stepped forward and unwrapped the plaque herself. The sunlight caught the engraving, gleaming against the bronze. "For grandmas who raised the house, then had to leave it." A hush fell. just long enough for the weight of the words to settle into the soil. Sadie brushed her hands on her jeans and looked up at her grandmother. "Do you think the tree will remember?" she asked. Margaret met her gaze, her expression tender. "It will," she said. "Some things grow stronger because they remember." Aubrey slipped her hand into Sadie's, the two girls standing shoulder to shoulder as they watched the breeze ripple through the young sapling's leaves. Jeanette sniffed audibly and wiped at one eye, muttering something about pollen as she turned away. Later that week, a letter arrived from Springfield High. The school had read about Margaret's work with the Baxter House Shelter and decided to start a scholarship in her name, the Margaret Baxter Scholarship for Kinship Caregivers. She read the letter twice, sitting by the window, sunlight warming the side of her face. A scholarship for those raising someone else's children. It was more fitting than any monument. It was alive, like the tree. It would keep growing. Jeanette found her there, still holding the letter, the hint of a smile tugging at her mouth. "Don't tell me," Jeanette said, plucking the paper from her hand. "They've decided to crown you Springfield's patron saint of grandmothers." Margaret chuckled, her eyes still fixed on the garden below. "Something like that." Jeanette joined her at the window, reading silently. After a moment, she exhaled softly. "This," she said, gesturing to the letter, the view, the laughter of residents echoing down the paths. "This is what surviving with elegance looks like." Margaret turned her head slightly, her gaze steady. "No," she said. "This is what not being erased looks like." The words carried more weight than she intended, and for a long moment, neither woman spoke. Jeanette reached over and gave her hand a quick squeeze. No words of agreement were needed. That night, Margaret walked the garden again. The lamps along the path glowed amber, and the scent of roses clung to the cool air. The willow rustled gently, and beneath it, the sapling stood straight, its thin branches trembling with life. She paused there, her hand brushing the plaque. For the first time, she didn't think of the house or the hurt. She thought of what had grown from it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the glow of the screen cutting through the dusk. She hesitated before looking. "Carolyn." The text was brief, as if written through gritted teeth. "You made your point." Margaret stared at the words for a long moment. The night air felt cool against her skin, the silence stretching wide around her. She didn't type a reply. Instead, she slipped the phone back into her pocket and turned toward the sapling, its leaves trembling in the breeze. Her reflection caught in the small brass plaque beneath it. She spoke softly, to the air, to the night, to whatever part of her daughter might still be listening. "I didn't make a point," she murmured. "I made peace." The wind stirred, carrying the scent of magnolia and soil. The young trees swayed, catching the lamplight just so, as if bowing in quiet acknowledgement. Margaret stood there a moment longer, her figure framed by the glow of the path lights, before turning back toward the manor, her walk steady, unhurried, the kind of stride that belonged to someone who no longer needed to explain herself to anyone. And somewhere behind her, the newly planted tree whispered in the wind, its roots beginning to claim the earth she'd once had to fight for. The morning came quietly, the kind of stillness that felt earned. Margaret sat on her balcony, wrapped in a soft cream sweater, a plate of toast and berries beside her. The sun crept over the Churchill Gardens, gilding the dew-dotted roses and shimmering off the glass tables below. The faint chatter of residents drifted up like a gentle hum. Tea being poured, pages turning, laughter breaking the silence in small, graceful bursts. A bird landed on the railing near her plate, bold and curious. Margaret smiled and broke off a piece of toast, setting it on the edge. "Go ahead," she said softly. "We've both fought for breakfast before." The bird tilted its head, then hopped closer. It was the first time in years that she'd eaten without glancing at a clock, without listening for footsteps, without the background noise of someone else's moods dictating her morning. This was her time, her peace. She picked up the newspaper folded neatly beside her teacup. The Springfield Chronicle headline caught her eye, not the bold print about politics or markets, but the smaller feature tucked into the lower corner. A home reborn, Baxter House, welcomes 3 families. Her breath caught. She unfolded the page. There it was, her old house, framed by a bright Missouri morning. Children played on the porch where she used to sip coffee. 2 grandmothers sat on the steps, chatting as laundry fluttered behind them. The windows were open, curtains drawn back, sunlight spilling through every frame. The caption beneath the photo read, "Once the site of a family's quiet unraveling, now a haven for others rebuilding theirs." Margaret's eyes softened. She traced the edge of the photo with her fingertips, feeling a strange warmth settle in her chest. Not nostalgia, not loss, but something deeper. Continuity. She took a slow sip of tea, letting the steam rise around her face. For the first time in a long time, the weight she'd carried felt entirely gone. No more binders, no more letters tucked away, no more waiting for someone else to see her value. Everything she needed was already visible. In the laughter below, the sunlit photograph, and the quiet steadiness of her own hands. Her phone chimed on the table. She picked it up, expecting a message from Jeanette, some sarcastic comment about the article. But instead, a photo filled the screen. Sadie. In the picture, her granddaughter stood at the kitchen counter, proudly holding a plate of pancakes, golden, slightly uneven, and stacked with the kind of enthusiasm that only love could make edible. The message below it read, "Pancakes turned out great, but yours are still better." Margaret laughed, a deep, unguarded sound that rolled through the quiet morning. She set the phone down, typed back without hesitation. "Then come back. I'll teach you again." She pressed send and leaned back in her chair, the corners of her mouth still curved. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the faint scent of magnolias from the courtyard. She closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm of birdsong and distant conversation. It was ordinary, peaceful, and completely hers. She thought briefly of Carolyn. Whether she had seen the article, whether the words had stung or soothed, Margaret couldn't say. But for the first time, she realized she didn't need to know. Some things were meant to be left behind, not because they didn't matter, but because they had already taken all the space they deserved. The sound of laughter rose from the garden below, Jeanette's unmistakable voice scolding a gardener for trimming too much off a rose bush. Margaret smiled, shaking her head. "Of course she's early," she murmured. Her gaze returned to the photo on the paper. The women on the porch were smiling, sunlight catching on their hair. Behind them, a child waved at the camera, frozen mid-motion. Life had returned to the house that once exiled her. And it no longer belonged to her pain, it belonged to her purpose. Margaret set the newspaper aside, picked up her tea, and watched the sky shift toward blue. The magnolias rustled gently, as if applauding the quiet conclusion of a story that had needed no grand finale, just peace. She thought of that night long ago. The kitchen, the shouting, the sound of plates clinking into the dishwasher while her daughter's words carved through the air. "If you won't go to a home, get out of our house." Margaret smiled now, not with bitterness, but with understanding. She had gone to a home, just not the one her daughter meant. She took one last sip of tea, the warmth filling her chest, and whispered to the morning air, as if closing a circle only she could see. My daughter screamed, "If you won't go to a home, get out of our house." An hour later, a limo arrived. And with that, Margaret Baxter folded the paper, rose from her chair, and walked back inside. Her steps light, her peace unshakable, her story, finally, her own.